June 2008, Nottinghamshire. A routine traffic stop on an ordinary afternoon. The kind of moment that happens thousands of times across Britain every single day, noticed by no one, recorded only in a police database, and then forgotten almost immediately. A young man pulled over. Minor driving infraction. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would change anything, or so it seemed. What happened next was procedure, standard protocol. When someone is arrested for a motoring offense in the United Kingdom, a DNA swab is taken. It's routine, automatic. The sample goes into the system. The young man was processed, dealt with, and released. He probably thought nothing of it. He had no way of knowing his DNA would solve a murder that had haunted a village for over 25 years. By June 2008, Colette Aram had been dead for almost exactly that long. She had been 16 years old when she vanished in October 1983. Abducted as she walked through Keyworth, a small village in Nottinghamshire, to visit her boyfriend. Her body was found the next morning in a field less than 2 miles from her home. What had been done to her was violent. What had been done to her family was permanent. For the first quarter-century after her death, the man responsible lived free. He was never caught. He was never even seriously pursued after the initial investigation collapsed. He existed in that peculiar space that haunts every cold case. Not forgotten exactly, but fading, a phantom, a case number, a file growing older in a cardboard box. Then something changed. The science caught up. When Colette was murdered in 1983, DNA profiling barely existed. The technology that would eventually become the foundation of modern forensic investigation was still theoretical. Evidence collected from her body and from the crime scene, biological material that could have been definitive, sat in storage while investigators worked with fingerprints and witness descriptions and photographs. They had what they needed. On paper, they had a description. They had leads. They had over 400 calls from members of the public who thought they knew something. None of it was enough. By 2008, everything had changed. The technology had evolved. A cold case team decided to revisit the evidence that had been preserved all those years. The samples sitting quietly in storage since 1983, waiting for science to catch up to the crime. They pulled a usable DNA profile. But here is where the story becomes something different from a straightforward database match. The profile they extracted didn't match anyone in the national database. The man they were looking for had no criminal history. He had never been arrested. He had lived quietly. He had built a life, and that life was completely invisible to the system designed to track people like him. So investigators tried something else. They searched for partial matches, relatives who shared enough genetic material to narrow the field. And on that day in June 2008, when a young man was pulled over for a traffic infraction and gave his DNA, the system found something. A near-perfect match. A familial link, so close it could only mean one thing. The young man was innocent, but his father wasn't. In that single moment, a case that had been cold for 25 years became active again. A phantom became a suspect, and a village that had learned to live with an unsolved murder discovered that the man responsible had been living among them the entire time. This is how the most devastating cold cases are sometimes solved, not through dramatic breakthroughs or deathbed confessions, but through the quiet, relentless work of technology, catching up to a crime that happened when the science to stop it didn't yet exist. If you want to know what happened next, how a traffic stop became an arrest, how a family finally got answers, and why those answers came with a cost no one anticipated, subscribe to the channel. You won't believe who this man turned out to be. Let's go back to October 1983. Colette Aram was 16 years old and training as a hairdresser. She had a boyfriend named Russell Godfrey, 17, freshly licensed. still carrying that particular excitement of someone who could drive anywhere he wanted without permission. For a few weeks, he had been collecting her on Sunday evenings, the two of them taking advantage of the car and the freedom it represented. It had become their routine. She never had to walk the roads alone after dark. But on October 30th, 1983, Russell's car was broken down. For a boy who had just tasted independence, a dead engine was more than an inconvenience. It was a barrier between him and his plans. Colette didn't see it as a problem. She was 16. The walk to his house was less than 2 miles. The evening was clear. She promised to be home by 9:30, hugged her mother at the door, and left. What happened in the time between her leaving and her mother expecting to hear from her became the foundation for everything that followed. Russell, waiting at home and frustrated by the delay, did what made sense. He pulled his bike out and set off to meet her halfway. He rode out into the October night, expecting to see her within minutes. The roads stayed empty. What should have been a simple ride became something else, without him quite noticing the transition. He turned back toward her house. He called. Her mother picked up. There was nothing reassuring to say. By 9 o'clock, the timeline had collapsed completely. By 10, they were calling emergency rooms. By 10:30, police officers were walking the route with the family, retracing every step of a walk that should have taken 20 minutes. They checked hedgerows, gardens, the sides of the road. There was no sign of a struggle, no dropped bag, no torn clothing, nothing overturned. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist, partway through an ordinary evening. The search was called off for the night, with a promise to resume at first light. Morning came gray and quiet. A man driving to work spotted a shape in a field, low against the ground, completely still. He slowed, turned around, and understood what he was looking at. Police were already being called. Somewhere else in the village, Colette's brother Mark was out searching on his own, not knowing yet that she had already been found. He saw the police tape first. He pushed past officers. That image, seeing his sister in that field, was something that would never leave him. What investigators found at the scene confirmed that this was not a disappearance. This was a murder. The evidence told them she had been subjected to violence. They began the work of building a timeline backward from her body, trying to understand how many hours of her life had been stolen, and by whom. The investigation that followed was enormous. Nottinghamshire police launched a full-scale manhunt. Hundreds of officers conducted door-to-door sweeps. Witness statements were collected by the dozens, then the hundreds. Within weeks, detectives had logged over 2,000 separate statements. The village that had never needed to be afraid began to look at itself differently. Neighbors who had known each other for years started wondering quietly if the person responsible might still be living among them. And then, 5 weeks after the murder, a letter arrived at the police station addressed to investigators. The handwriting was slanted, drawn with deliberate strangeness, as if someone had gone out of their way to disguise it. The content was worse. It contained specific details about the attack that had never been released to the public. Details only the killer could have known. It ended with an arrogant line, "You will never get me." Whoever had written it made a mistake. A single fingerprint pressed faintly into the paper near the edge. A fingerprint could have changed everything. It should have. In theory, it was exactly the kind of evidence that should solve a case immediately. Except fingerprints are only useful if you already have someone to match them against. They didn't. So the letter went into evidence. The fingerprint was documented and filed, and the investigation kept moving, chasing a man who existed only as a shape built out of second-hand memories and a few slanted lines on a page. A phantom who would remain invisible to the system for nearly another quarter-century. By the end of 1983, Colette's killer had sent his letter. Police had their fingerprint. Witnesses had described him. The investigation was in full motion, consuming resources and energy and the attention of an entire police force. There was momentum. There was the feeling that an answer was close. And then the ground shifted under everything. 1984 was one of the most turbulent years in modern British history. A national miners' strike tore through the country, pulling officers away from ordinary casework and into the middle of a labor conflict that consumed entire police forces for months. Resources that should have gone toward tracking down one man in one small Nottinghamshire village were suddenly needed everywhere else at once. The investigation didn't officially close. Nobody ever told the family it was over. But somewhere between 12 and 18 months in, without any single dramatic moment marking the change, the case quietly shrank. Fewer officers assigned, fewer new leads to chase. A file that got opened less and less frequently. The man who had promised in his own handwriting that he would never be caught appeared to be right. What happened next was something that only families who have lived through unsolved murders understand. Life continued. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Months became years. Colette remained 16 years old forever. Photographs froze her in time. But the world kept moving without her, and her family had to find a way to move with it. Her parents had to wake up every morning knowing that the person who had done this was still alive, still breathing, still walking somewhere in England. The investigation had stalled, which meant no answers were coming. No resolution, no moment when they could finally understand why their daughter had been taken. The toll was visible almost immediately. Colette's grandfather, Arthur, was a strong man, the kind who had built a business with his own hands and never complained about his health. He had been one of the first to see Colette's body at the mortuary. 6 months later, he was dead. A heart condition that had never been flagged before suddenly became fatal. The family never said it directly, but they didn't have to. Colette's murder had already claimed a second life before anyone had even found the man responsible. For the rest of the village, the case became something different. It became a story people told. The girl who disappeared. The unsolved murder. The case that had launched the BBC's first ever criminal appeal television program, Crimewatch, when it aired in June 1984. Over 400 calls had come in that night. Thousands of tips from across the country. From cities the killer had never set foot in. From people who thought they recognized him, thought they knew something, thought they could help. None of it was enough. Years passed. The 1980s became the 1990s. The village of Keyworth tried to heal. The investigation files went into cardboard boxes. And while Colette's family carried a grief that would never fully resolve, the man who wrote that letter simply walked out into the sunshine and began building a perfectly normal life. He smiled for photographs. He stood beside community figures at events. He became a husband, twice in fact, a father, a man people trusted enough to hand responsibility to. He took on civic roles, attended school events, participated in charity work, the kind of quiet, respectable roles that society reserves for people considered decent. He built all of it brick by brick, year by year, on top of what he had done, and nobody around him ever thought to look underneath. In 2004, 21 years after Colette's murder, the BBC ran Crimewatch's 20th anniversary special. The case was featured again. Cold cases sometimes get a second chance on television. Sometimes new witnesses come forward. Sometimes someone remembers something they had forgotten. Sometimes the public's attention shifts a case just enough to unstick it. This time, nothing happened. Another 400 calls. Another dead end. But somewhere in the background, technology was changing. Scientists were getting better at extracting usable genetic material from old evidence. DNA profiling was becoming more sophisticated. The science was catching up. And in 2008, when a cold case team decided to take another look at the evidence that had been sitting in storage since 1983, they would discover that everything was about to change. For Colette's family, after 25 years of silence, the waiting was finally about to end. Between 2004 and 2008, something fundamental shifted in how British police approached old crimes. It wasn't a single decision or a dramatic policy change. It was more gradual than that. It was science moving faster than it had before. It was the growing recognition that evidence collected decades earlier, evidence that had seemed useless at the time, might suddenly become valuable. The blood samples taken from Colette's body in 1983 had been preserved. The semen samples had been preserved. These biological materials had been stored in evidence rooms for over 2 decades, waiting for technology to catch up to the crime. In the 80s and early 90s, DNA profiling existed, but it was crude, incomplete. The fragments that could be extracted from old evidence were too small, too degraded, too unreliable to be useful in court. But by the 2000s, the science had evolved dramatically. New techniques allowed investigators to pull genetic profiles from evidence that would have been useless just 10 years earlier. Degraded samples that seemed hopeless in 1995 suddenly became viable in 2005. The threshold for what constituted a usable profile kept dropping. The possibility kept expanding. This is where the cold case decision came in. Sometime around 2004, Nottinghamshire police made a choice. The Colette Aram investigation had never officially closed. Cases like this, murders where a perpetrator was never caught, don't actually close. They remain open indefinitely, theoretically active, even if no one is actively working them. But reopening a case requires resources. It requires assigning officers to work through old evidence, to re-examine witness statements, to try new investigative angles. It requires deciding that the possibility of solving a murder is worth the cost. Someone made that decision. A cold case team was formed. This wasn't unique to Colette's case. By 2008, cold case units existed across British police forces. They were staffed by investigators who specialized in taking old, seemingly unsolvable cases and applying new techniques to them, new forensic methods, new database systems, new technology that didn't exist when the crime was committed. Sometimes they succeeded, sometimes they didn't. But they worked on the principle that evidence doesn't age the way memory does. Physical evidence, properly preserved, can be tested again and again as science improves. The cold case team pulled Colette's file. They looked at what evidence had been collected. They made a crucial decision: to attempt DNA profiling again on the biological samples from 1983. This was the turning point, though nobody knew it yet. What made this decision possible was evidence preservation. If the blood and semen samples had been contaminated over the years, if they had been stored improperly, if they had been lost or mishandled, this moment would never have come. But someone, decades earlier, had made sure that the evidence from Colette's crime scene was stored carefully, in a cool, controlled environment, protected from degradation, treated as if it might matter again someday. It mattered. The cold case team sent the samples for testing. This time, new technology pulled something usable from the old evidence: a DNA profile, a complete genetic fingerprint from whoever had murdered Colette Aram. For the first time in 25 years, investigators had something concrete to work with. Not a description, not a fingerprint from a taunting letter, not witness statements that had grown fuzzy with time. A biological profile that could be matched against a database. They ran it through the national system. Nothing came back. The man they were looking for had never been arrested for anything. He was invisible to the database. All that work, all that careful evidence preservation, all that hope that new technology would finally provide an answer, and the answer pointed at nobody. Or so it seemed. But investigators had another tool available to them now. If the suspect himself wasn't on record, perhaps a relative was. DNA doesn't exist in isolation. It runs through families. Siblings share DNA. Cousins share DNA. Children inherit DNA from their parents. If the investigators couldn't find the killer, perhaps they could find someone related to him. They began searching for partial matches. The list that came back had hundreds of names on it. Hundreds of names. One by one, investigators worked through them. Not him. Not him. Not him. Each name was a potential lead. Each one required contact, verification, comparison of DNA. Each one had to be ruled out. The process was methodical and slow. It was also, for most of those hundreds of names, a dead end. But somewhere in that list was the answer. Familial DNA matching is different from a traditional database hit. When a suspect is arrested and their DNA is taken, that profile goes into the national database alongside everyone else's. If someone commits a crime and DNA is recovered from the scene, investigators can run it through the database and look for an exact match. One person whose genetic profile matches the evidence perfectly. That's straightforward. That's a direct connection. Familial matching works on a different principle. Instead of looking for an exact match, investigators search for partial matches. Profiles that are similar enough to suggest a biological relationship. A parent and child share approximately 50% of their DNA. Siblings share a similar percentage. Cousins share less, but still enough to register as a match in a database designed to detect family connections. The logic is simple. If you can't find the person who committed the crime, perhaps you can find someone related to them. And once you know they have a relative in the system, you can narrow your search to family members of that person. You can investigate siblings. You can investigate parents. You can investigate children. You can build a family tree and work through it systematically. This is exactly what investigators were doing when they worked through those hundreds of names. Then, in June 2008, something extraordinary happened. A young man was pulled over for a motoring infraction. Nothing serious, nothing that would normally matter. He was arrested, processed, and as is standard procedure in the United Kingdom, a DNA sample was taken from him. Routine. Automatic. The sample went into the system. And the system flagged it. The young man's DNA was a near-perfect match to the profile recovered from Colette Aram's crime scene in 1983. For a moment, it must have seemed like the case was finally solved. A direct match. A killer identified. Everything pointing to one person. Except for one problem. The young man was 20 years old at the time of his arrest. He had been born in 1988, 5 years after Colette was murdered. He couldn't possibly have committed the crime. His DNA matched because he shared genetic material with someone who could have. He was related to the person they were looking for. He was the son of the person they were looking for. This is the elegant power of familial DNA matching. It doesn't solve the case directly. It narrows the field. It says, the person who committed this crime is biologically related to this person. The person who committed this crime is likely in this family. Now investigate the family. Investigators pulled everything they could find on the young man's father. His name was Paul Stuart Hutchinson. He was 50 years old. He lived in Gamston, Nottinghamshire, not far from Keyworth. And when investigators dug deeper, they found something that made their pulse quicken. In 1983, he had lived even closer to Colette Aram. He had lived within 7 streets of her home in West Bridgford. He had been working as an electrician for British Rail at the time of the murder. He would have had a car. He would have had opportunity. He would have had proximity. And now, thanks to a routine traffic stop that had happened 25 years after Colette's death, investigators had a name. They had a suspect. They had a direct connection between a man and a crime that had gone unsolved for over 2 decades. Here is where cold case investigations often falter or succeed, based on a single factor: evidence. If Paul Hutchinson's DNA matched the profile from Colette's murder, investigators needed to be certain of it. They needed to confirm it. They needed to have absolute certainty before they made an arrest that could change multiple lives. So they took another sample from Paul Hutchinson himself. The match was exact. This was no longer a family connection. This was not a partial match requiring inference and logic. This was a direct biological link between a man and a murder victim. This was the breakthrough that investigators had been waiting for across 25 years of silence. On April 2, 2009, Paul Stuart Hutchinson was arrested at his home in Gamston and charged with the murder of Colette Aram. He had been living 30 miles away from the village where he had committed the crime, but his son had been arrested in the wrong place at the wrong time, for the wrong reason, and that small chance event had finally connected investigators to the man they had been looking for. Where are you watching from? Comment below and let us know. Has this case struck a chord with you? And here's a question worth thinking about. If familial DNA technology had existed in 1984, do you think this case would have been solved decades earlier? What would have been different? Tell us your thoughts. When Paul Hutchinson was arrested on April 2, 2009, he had one immediate advantage. He had been living freely for 25 years. He had built a life. He had a family. He had a reputation. He had roots in the community. And he had had a quarter-century to construct a narrative that protected him. He chose not to stay silent. When investigators confronted him with the DNA evidence, the match that placed him at Colette Aram's murder scene, Hutchinson did something calculated. He attempted to deflect. He attempted to shift blame. He said his deceased brother Gerhard had committed the murder, not him. Gerhard had died in January 2008, just months before this arrest. Gerhard had been cremated, which meant his remains were no longer available for testing. It was a calculated lie. It was the kind of lie someone might construct if they believed there was no way to disprove it. If a body is cremated, there is no DNA to recover, no way to definitively rule out that person. If Gerhard was dead and gone, Hutchinson might have reasoned, then blaming him was safe. It was a phantom accusation against someone who could not defend himself or be tested. But investigators had already thought of this possibility. When they began investigating Hutchinson, they had looked into his family, and they discovered that Gerhard's DNA had been taken years earlier, a blood sample kept on file by a hospital. They ran the brothers' genetic profile against the sample from Colette's crime scene. It did not match. The DNA was an exact match for Paul. Only Paul. Not his brother. Not anyone else. Just him. When investigators told him this, when they showed him that his attempt to deflect blame had failed, Hutchinson's options collapsed. The evidence was irrefutable. His own DNA was at the crime scene. His brother's was not. There was nowhere left to hide. On October 5, 2009, Hutchinson appeared at Nottingham Crown Court and pleaded not guilty to the murder. A trial date was set for December. He had 6 weeks to prepare a defense against evidence that was, by any reasonable standard, insurmountable. But before we get to what happened in that courtroom, it's important to understand who Paul Hutchinson had become in the 25 years between the murder and his arrest. By 2009, he was married. He had been married twice, in fact. He had fathered 4 children. He was a man who had spent 2.5 decades building a life that looked, from the outside, completely ordinary. He had worked. He had run a newspaper delivery business. He had been involved in community work. He had taken on civic responsibilities. He was his estate's tenant's representative, a position that requires trust, that requires people to believe you are the kind of person who can be relied upon to advocate for them. Nobody in his community knew that he had murdered a 16-year-old girl. Nobody knew that he had spent the night of October 30, 1983, abducting a teenager, assaulting her, and strangling her to death. Nobody knew that he had left her body in a field and then walked into a pub, ordered a meal, and sat calmly while blood dried on his hands. Nobody knew that he had written a taunting letter to the police, bragging about what he had done. His family did not know. His children did not know. The people who had handed him positions of responsibility did not know. The neighbors who trusted him did not know. He had constructed an entire life on top of a murder, brick by brick, year by year, never allowing a crack to show. This is a particular kind of psychological architecture. It is not the work of someone who is delusional or unaware of what they have done. It requires active, sustained effort. It requires the ability to compartmentalize. It requires the capacity to be two people simultaneously, the respectable community figure and the person who had committed an unspeakable crime. It requires lying not just to others, but to yourself. And it works, for a time. It works until the moment it doesn't. That moment came when the DNA results arrived. That moment came when his brother's blood sample failed to match. That moment came when Hutchinson realized that the lie he had constructed was insufficient, that the deflection he had attempted would not work, that he had, finally, run out of room to hide. The arrest itself would have been disorienting. The interrogation would have been brutal in its clarity. Investigators had physical evidence. They had his DNA. They had him at the crime scene. Biologically, irrefutably. There was no ambiguity. There was no way to suggest innocence or misunderstanding. And so Hutchinson's immediate response was to attempt one final lie, to blame someone who was beyond the reach of justice. When that failed, when investigators showed him the evidence against his brother, he would have understood that the game was over. 25 years of freedom, 25 years of building a false life, all of it collapsing, in the moment when science finally caught up to a crime committed before the technology to solve it existed. Here's a question for you. Why do you think he blamed his brother instead of simply remaining silent? What does that choice tell us about his psychological state in that interrogation room? Comment below with your theory. What was he thinking in that moment? Between his arrest in April 2009 and the beginning of his trial in December, Paul Hutchinson spent months in custody, months in a cell, months with nothing but time and the knowledge that the evidence against him was absolute. No trial strategy could overcome DNA. No legal argument could create reasonable doubt when his genetic profile was literally embedded in the crime scene. No character witness could matter when his own biology condemned him. For 6 months, he waited. What happened during that time was something that investigators sometimes see in high-profile cases, particularly when the evidence is this overwhelming. Hutchinson began to talk, not to police, not to lawyers, but to other inmates. He confessed to fellow prisoners while awaiting trial. This is a crucial detail in criminal psychology. Confessing to inmates is not confessing to authorities in any formal sense. It's not admissible in court as a primary piece of evidence. But it reveals something about the psychological state of someone who knows they are trapped. When someone facing an impossible situation begins unprompted to tell strangers about their guilt, it often means they have accepted the reality of what they have done. It often means they have moved past denial and into something else. Not quite resignation, but a kind of psychological capitulation. The pressure of carrying a secret for 25 years, followed by the sudden exposure of that secret through science, followed by months of incarceration while waiting for trial, changes something in a person. The false life that Hutchinson had constructed, the respectable facade, the community figure, the father and husband, all of it had been stripped away in an instant. What remained was just the man and what he had done. On December 21, 2009, the trial began at Nottingham Crown Court. Hutchinson had initially pleaded not guilty, which meant the trial was supposed to proceed with prosecutors presenting evidence and a defense attempting to create doubt. But trials rarely proceed as planned when the evidence is this unambiguous. On the first day of trial, Hutchinson changed his plea. He pleaded guilty. This was not a procedural formality. This was not something that could be easily dismissed or explained away. A guilty plea is a moment of immense consequence in a courtroom. It is a person, before a judge and before the law, accepting responsibility for a crime. It is the moment when all pretense ends. And in that moment, in that courtroom, Hutchinson gave an account of what had happened on October 30th, 1983. The details mattered. Not because they changed the outcome, he was already guilty in his own words, but because they provided the first official accounting of what had actually occurred. For a family that had spent 25 years in darkness, waiting to understand what had happened to their daughter, this moment was when some answers finally became available. According to his statement, Hutchinson had spent part of that day waiting at a hut near a riding stable outside the village. Girls rode horses in that area on Sunday afternoons. He had been waiting there, apparently, hoping to encounter someone. At some point that afternoon, he had stolen a red Ford Fiesta. He had armed himself with a bread knife, and then he had driven around the village, cruising the streets, looking for an opportunity. When he saw Colette walking alone on Nicker Hill, he took it. What happened next was violence. What happened next was rape. What happened next was strangulation. What happened next was leaving her body in a field and then walking into a pub as if nothing had occurred, ordering food, sitting calmly while people looked at him, leaving blood on his hands for a landlady to notice. All of this he had carried alone for 25 years. All of this he had kept separate from his second marriage, his children, his community roles, his careful construction of respectability. Why did he confess? The psychological literature on confessions in high-evidence cases suggests several possibilities. Sometimes people confess when they have accepted that escape is impossible. Sometimes the relief of no longer hiding overwhelms the fear of punishment. Sometimes family pressure, the knowledge that children and spouses will suffer through a prolonged trial, becomes the deciding factor. Sometimes the simple fact of being found, after so many years of hiding, creates a kind of psychological collapse where maintaining the false story becomes more exhausting than accepting the truth. Hutchinson had been interviewed as part of the original investigation in 1983. At that time, there had been insufficient evidence to charge him. He had been cleared, at least provisionally. He had walked free. For 25 years he had believed he had escaped. For 25 years he had built a life on that belief. Then, in June 2008, a young man he had fathered was arrested for a traffic infraction. One DNA sample. One routine procedure. And suddenly, everything he had constructed collapsed. By December, in that courtroom, he could not maintain it anymore. The false life was over. The only thing left was to accept what he had done, and hope that acceptance might somehow diminish the weight of it. It would not. On January 25, 2010, Paul Hutchinson stood in Nottingham Crown Court and received his sentence. Life imprisonment. A minimum of 25 years before he would be eligible for parole. He was 50 years old. The minimum term meant he would be 75 before the possibility of release could even be considered. For all practical purposes, he would die in prison. The sentence was just. The evidence was unambiguous. The crime was among the most serious a court could punish. And yet, for Colette's family, the sentence could never be adequate. No amount of time in a cell could restore what had been taken. No punishment could answer the questions that had accumulated over 25 years of silence. But the story did not end with sentencing. 8 months later, in October 2010, guards at Nottingham Prison discovered Paul Hutchinson unconscious in his cell. He had taken an overdose of medication. Despite the fact that he had been considered a suicide risk, despite the fact that prison officials had been aware of his deteriorating mental state, he had been taken off suicide watch. The inquest that followed would determine that no mental health professionals had been present at the meeting where that decision was made. An inquest jury ruled his death a suicide. He had lasted less than a year in prison. His wife had filed for divorce while he was incarcerated. His daughter, Hannah Hussein, told the inquest that he had become increasingly depressed after learning that his wife wanted nothing to do with him. The man who had built a life on deception, who had constructed a false identity so carefully that 4 children and a community had believed in it. That man could not survive the moment when the false life was stripped away and he was left alone with what he actually was. He took the coward's way out, as Colette's mother would later say. For Colette's family, his death in prison was not closure. It was not justice. It was simply another loss, another absence, another unanswered question. Colette's uncle, Michael Layton, told the media after the inquest hearing that the ruling did not make Colette's death any easier to bear. And her mother, Jacqui Kirkby, spoke words that capture the particular cruelty of cases like this. "We are never, ever going to get closure, because we never got answers, and we never will." He never showed any more remorse, and he took the coward's way out. This is the profound difference between solving a case and achieving justice. A case can be solved. DNA can match. A perpetrator can be identified. A guilty plea can be entered. An investigation can be closed. But closure, true closure, requires something that a perpetrator often refuses to give: answers, understanding, an explanation for why. Why did Paul Hutchinson spend that October afternoon waiting at a riding stable? Why did he steal a car? Why did he arm himself with a knife? Why, at some point in his life, had he decided that taking a child's life was something he was capable of? What had he been looking for in those hours before he found Colette? What void was he trying to fill? He never said. Even in his guilty plea, even in his courtroom confession, he provided facts but not context. He described what he had done, but not why. He took those answers with him when he died in his prison cell. This is what remains after a murder is solved, the unsolvable part. The psychological architecture of a crime. The interior life of a person who can live alongside normal people, who can be trusted with responsibility, who can father children and maintain relationships, all while carrying the capacity to commit something irredeemable. Colette Aram's life ended on October 30th, 1983, on a country road in Nottinghamshire. She was 16 years old. She would never have another birthday. She would never see another sunrise. The potential of her life, everything she might have become, was erased in the space of a few hours by someone she had never met. Paul Hutchinson lived for another 26 years after that. He lived freely for 25 of them. He built a family. He earned respect. He integrated himself into a community. He had a life that, from the outside, looked like the life of an ordinary person. Then science caught up. Then a traffic stop in June 2008 connected a son's DNA to a father's crime. Then 25 years of hiding collapsed in a matter of days. Then he spent 8 months in a cell before choosing to end it. For Colette's family, there is no resolution to that story. There is only the knowledge that the man who took their daughter is gone, that they will never understand why. That closure, in the way we typically think of it, will never come. What remains is memory. What remains is the work of investigators who refuse to let a case go cold. What remains is the science that finally caught up to a crime committed before it existed. What remains is the story of a 16-year-old girl who deserved a life, and the complicated, tragic aftermath of the moment when she did not get one. If you want to understand cases like this, if you want to follow investigations that span decades, that involve cutting-edge forensic science, that grapple with the deepest questions about how criminals hide in plain sight, subscribe to this channel. These stories matter. These people deserve to be remembered, and the work of pursuing justice, even incomplete justice, deserves to be seen.